Hey Jude. It's more than just a beloved Beatles song, it's a testament to the power of empathy and the unbreakable bonds of friendship, even in the face of life's greatest challenges. The Beatles have never been short on writing incredible, heartfelt songs with personal meaning. And I'm talking about melodic hits such as Eleanor Rigby, Blackbird. If you hear the song title Hey Jude, then you immediately think the Beatles. But this song came at a moment of crisis in Paul McCartney's life. Like me, you may have believed that this song was written by Paul for John Lennon's son, Julian. But then I found out about the hidden message that lies further in Hey Jude, and Paul maybe didn't want his fans to know about it. Cue my mind being blown.
What I have to say is all in the music. If I want to say anything, I write a song.
So, what was this song actually about?
So what was this song actually about? Make sure you stick around, and you'll find out.
I've been baking bread and looking after the baby. Rock and roll was not fun anymore. I chose not to take the standard options. I was boxed in.
There's a reason Paul is a writing legend. As an empathetic person, he always manages to create songs that resonated with the audience. Hey Jude was written at a time when Paul saw the struggles John was facing after his marriage breakdown to his first wife, Cynthia, and the effect that was having on his son, Julian. We might think that A-listers like the Beatles don't have the same emotional baggage as us regular folk do, but trust me, beneath the shiny, starry surface of fame, the strains of family life take a toll on everyone, even musical legends.
I've been under contract since I was 22, and I was always supposed to. I became an artist because I cherished freedom. I couldn't fit into a classroom or office. Freedom was the plus for all the minuses of being an oddball. But suddenly I was obliged to the media, obliged to the public. It wasn't free at all.
More than anything, the song Hey Jude is about saying goodbye. It spoke to the masses so profoundly because it was conceived of in the heart of Paul's personal vulnerability. It also represented the end of an era, in youth, collaborative work, and ultimately friendship. Paul didn't hold back, and he poured his true feelings into this song, penning lyrics such as, "For well you know that it's a fool who plays it cool by making his world a little colder." Ouch. For John, that must have stung coming from his friend.
Paul can be very cynical and much more biting than me when he's driven to it. Of course, he's got more patience, but he can carve people up in no time at all when he's pushed. He hits the nail on the head and doesn't beat about the bush, does Paul.
Would Paul come to regret the lyrics he so thoughtfully created? Or would they become imprints of true compassion and genuine understanding, not just for the world, but for Paul himself years down the road? Stay around to discover more.
Most people don't have a companion who will tell the truth. Yoko showed me the possibility of the alternative. You don't have to do this.
So let's go back to those dark days when John's marriage came to an abrupt end. 3 months before Hey Jude was recorded, John's wife Cynthia was away on vacation in Greece with friends, while John stayed at home. In the back of her mind, she knew her husband was cheating on her, and being so far away only added intensity to her instinct. Something wasn't right, and she needed to know for sure.
There was this girl called Yoko Ono. She showed up at my house one day. It was John Cage's birthday, and she said she wanted to get hold of manuscripts of various composers to give to him, and she wanted one from me. So I said, well, it's okay by me, but you'll have to go to John. And she did.
So, Cynthia returned early from her trip, arriving unexpectedly back at their home in Kenwood, England. She was hoping she was imagining things and she'd be greeted by her loving husband. Instead, she walked in and found Yoko Ono sitting in her living room wearing her bathrobe. As her world came crashing down around her, she got the brutal confirmation that she'd come looking for. Her marriage was over. Unfortunately, marriages do end. Love fails and relationships break down. People become stagnant, or they change and grow away from their partners. In this growth, they may wholeheartedly find someone better fit for their unique passions and talents. However one views a breakup, separation is always hard, especially for a young family. A darkness loomed over John during this difficult time. But rather than chastise his best friend for cheating on his wife, Paul had a message of love and support instead. While many people had they known the truth, might have considered Paul's message to John to be controversial. It really wasn't at all. Paul only ever did anything with good meaning. His lyrics, "Hey Jude, don't be afraid, you are made to go out and get her. The minute you let her under your skin, then you begin to make it better." That was Paul's way of telling John that he did what he had to do. He followed his heart. He listened to his intuition. He crossed paths with what would later be considered one of the greatest soulmate couples of all time in pop culture. Was Paul essentially telling John that he was made for Yoko? For music fans around the world, this became a rallying cry to pursue love and not to let the one get away. John had gotten Cynthia pregnant in college, and he did the honorable thing by marrying her. Although he cared deeply for her still, when he met Yoko in 1966, he knew in his heart that he had just met his soulmate.
When I fell in love with Yoko, I knew, my God, this is different from anything I have ever known. This is something other. This is more than a hit record, more than gold, more than everything. It is indescribable.
John fell in love, and in doing so, he caused a whirlpool of chaos to open up around him. But surely, Paul watching on and then doing what he did best, writing a song about it, did that go down well with John? And what was the significance of the F-bomb hidden within the song? Yup, more on that later. First off, let's delve further into the events after the fateful day when John's marriage ended, and out of the ashes, his relationship with Yoko was free to blossom.
Instead of being something in the rock and roll scene, I went back to being a house husband. I had to face myself and face that reality.
Shortly after finding out about John and Yoko's affair, Paul hopped into his Aston Martin DB6 and drove to Cynthia's house. Uh-oh. How would you feel if your best bud went and visited your ex? Pretty awkward. Paul's reasoning for this was that he was a friend of the family and he wanted to be there for Cynthia. And of course, he meant no malice by it. Quite the opposite, in fact. As he drove, his mind buzzed with thoughts on loss and transformation. He was on a kind of sensitivity and kindness mission, one that would ignite his storytelling skills and ideas seeped from his subconscious into creative form. Words, tones, notes, and emotional expressions swept through his mind as he drove through the British countryside.
I thought, as a friend of the family, I would motor out to Weybridge and tell them that everything was all right.
Flashes of inspiration erupted, all right, and those moments of magic sparked one of the greatest Beatles songs ever written. This gentle soul thought about the pain both Cynthia and Julian must have been feeling. And as those stories of his own life played in the background, one solid truth remained. Music always has a serene way of simplifying things.
Try and cheer them up, basically, and see how they were. I had about an hour's drive. I would always turn the radio off and try and make up songs just in case.
He mulled over the idea and probably thought, if only life's troubles could be resolved with a catchy chorus and a bridge, I'd write a hit song to mend the heart, starting with Let It Be, regardless of whether the person was married or not.
I started singing, Hey Jules, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. It was optimistic, a hopeful message for Julian. Come on, man. Your parents got divorced. I know you're not happy, but you'll be okay.
Once seated with Cynthia and Julian in the living room of a home that would never be referred to as John's house again, Paul felt the absence even more acutely in the empty 6-bedroom mansion. Things would definitely never be the same again. But Paul took it upon himself to let the little family know that they were not entering into this new period of their lives alone.
Paul told me he'd been thinking about my circumstances, about what I was going through and what I'd have to go through.
To lighten the mood, Paul even asked Cynthia to marry him.
Hey, Sin, want to get married?
This much-needed distraction of humor was just what the doctor ordered, and Cynthia burst out laughing. Over milky tea and buttery crumpets, they all sat and talked while Paul lent his most sympathetic ear. Music journalist Rob Sheffield, who coincidentally was born the year of John and Cynthia's separation, was mystified by Paul's kind response to such devastation.
I can't even begin to process that Paul, with all the other distractions and temptations available to him, on a summer afternoon, spent it going to check on the two of them. That's a mind-blowing anecdote that can't be fully explained, this instinctive, impulsive warmth.
Cynthia also never forgot this kind gesture amid a depressing time in her life.
I live like a hermit at Kenwood, concentrating on my son. Yeah, I went to meetings with lawyers and came home drained and sad, but apart from that, I barely went out, and John's clothes were still in our wardrobe.
Little Julian was only 6 years old at the time, and he had already lived through the release of 8 Beatles records. Paul has spoken about a very heartbreaking moment with Julian, which magnifies the disconnect John had with his nuclear family. Paul easily played a pirate game with Julian, and John later asked him how he did it. How he so seamlessly moved into the imagination of a child. Goofy play and childlike make-believe were completely alien to John. This goes to show how different Paul and John both were, but it also illustrates the strengths each possessed in their friendship.
Paul and I used to hang out quite a bit, more than Dad and I did. There seemed to be far more pictures of me and Paul playing at that age than me and Dad.
So, however awkward Paul visiting Cynthia may have been viewed as by others, he only did it because he knew Cynthia was suffering, and he wanted to show her support. He understood that John had followed his heart, but it didn't mean he condoned the heartbreak he left behind. In visiting Cynthia, Paul did what he felt was right. But what would you do in that situation? Would you visit Cynthia or would you talk to John? Let us know in the comments. Paul and John had a love of music in common, but like all friendships, they were two different people who functioned and performed in diversified ways. Paul was gentle, loving, open, and in a sense, somewhat innocent, while John was more serious, introspective, and at times a bit cynical. But the fusion of brilliance that came from these two minds is what made the Beatles so great. Do you have a friend who is a complete contrast to you? If you have a John to your Paul, let us know in the comments. But this was only the beginning of the Hey Jude saga, as it magnified another separation that was slowly brewing, one that would transform Paul and John's relationship forever.
Yoko and I attempted a few times to make music together. We think either people have forgotten or they have grown up by now.
As well as cheating on Cynthia, John was, in a very different way, cheating on Paul. John and Yoko were not just having a love affair, they were also writing and recording songs. At this point in history, it was unheard of for the Beatles to make music with others. And John and Yoko weren't just working on a few songs here and there, they were writing full-on albums together. But did this feel like the ultimate betrayal to Paul? This was even before Eric Clapton and Billy Preston were allowed to work with the band. In fact, when Clapton was invited to work on their 11th studio release, Abbey Road, a few years later, his response was, "Oh no, I can't do that. Nobody's ever played on a Beatles record." John was the first person to cross this line, and once it had been crossed, there was no going back.
I've withdrawn many times. Part of me is a monk and part a performing flea. The fear in the music business is that you don't exist if you're not at Xenon with Andy Warhol. As I found out, life doesn't end when you stop subscribing to Billboard.
The songs John was secretly recording with Yoko would become the basis for their first album, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. This is not collectively considered to be some of Lennon's finest work. However, this initial album became the blueprint for other classic compilations, such as Plastic Ono Band and Imagine. John seemed to have been looking for another musical partner for some time at that point, whether he was aware of it or not. Introspective souls like John's sometimes require change and rebirth even when what they have is already good. For all of John's flaws and drawbacks, he was an artist, and artists are complicated individuals. They need newness, like fresh air, for inspiration to be achieved. Even though John and Paul had changed the world of music, fashion, politics, and even hairstyles together, was this the end of the road for their creative partnership? So the question is, did Paul know the inevitability of what was happening? Did he know he was being quietly replaced by Yoko? It sucks when a seemingly solid friendship changes and one person is left feeling replaced. But this wasn't just a friendship. This rift left the other members of the Beatles thinking this could be the end of the band. In Hey Jude, we see that Paul was aware of this, and that the song was used to express his feelings about it. The lyrics, "It's a fool who plays it cool," it tells us that Paul was not ashamed of his sentiments, and that what he believed, that feeling and expressing your feelings is a healthy and positive thing to do. Possibly the most telling lyrics regarding the deepest and possibly saddest farewell of a friendship is felt in Paul's writing. So let it out, let it in. Hey Jude, begin. You're waiting for someone to perform with. Paul was clearly saying, go out and get her. both romantically and musically. He was giving John his grace. He was also expressing to all of us how he felt, or at least wanted to feel. He was giving him his creative freedom. He was saying, let me go and let her in. It's okay, all good things eventually come to an end. We have to walk our own paths, even if that means leaving each other's behind. The lyrics, remember to let her into your heart, then you can start to make things better, also resonates with the true meaning of the Beatles, that love, peace, and mindfulness are the highest goods, as shown in songs like Across the Universe. So ultimately, there were no hard feelings from Paul, even though he was likely hurting internally, because loss is never easy, especially when it's your best friend. But the questions remain. Why did he say this was just a message for Julian, and why was an F-bomb written into such a personal song? To understand that, we have to know how it was first created. In Paul's home on Cavendish Avenue, John and Yoko came to hear Hey Jude for the first time. Paul brought them upstairs to the music room where he sat down at the magic piano, a rainbow-colored, abstractly painted instrument that Paul wrote many Beatles songs on.
The whole Beatle idea was to do what you want. I respect craftsmen, but I am not interested in becoming one.
One can only imagine the thoughts that were moving through Paul's head. There he was, playing a song originally called Hey Jules, for his best friend's distraught son. That wasn't all though. Paul was also speaking lyrical truths through art form to John about his new musical partner, Yoko. His truths were blessings, of course, but the experience must have been pretty emotionally heavy.
As I played it to them, and when I got to the line, the movement you need is on your shoulder, I looked over my shoulder and I said, I'll change that, it's a bit crummy. I was just blocking it out. And John said, you won't, you know. That's the best line in it.
Because the duo had been drifting apart, Paul was so grateful that John's insistence of this line was like putting a little piece of himself in the song forever.
When someone is that firm about a line that you're gonna junk, and he said, oh no, keep it in. So, of course, you love that line twice as much because it's a little stray, it's a little mutt that you were about to put down, and it was reprieved, and so it's more beautiful than ever. I love those words now.
Regardless of how strong Paul was, this small gesture from a friendship formed in adolescence made him realize how much he valued John's opinions. In that moment, they both realized that their paths had changed, but the adoration they shared for each other had not. Paul would cherish this moment for the rest of his life, even if, at the time, his feelings were bittersweet. Friendships, especially ones that are founded on inspiration and creativity, are constantly shifting. Within them, we all experience a range of emotions and transitions. This spectrum of feeling was no different for Paul. Even the sweetest person in the world can still feel wounded. So what about the F-bomb? Well, at 2 minutes and 56 seconds in, the recording of Hey Jude is interrupted by Paul dropping the F-bomb. Amidst the wonderful vocals and instrumental progressions, Paul let that frustration slip after hitting a wrong note on the piano. Paul wanted to take it out.
Most people won't ever spot it, but we'll know it's there.
Hey Jude is all about taking risks and making emotional leaps. And what bigger risk was there than sneaking the mother of all swear words into the radio in 1968? It may not seem like a big deal today, but back then it was a devilishly brave call. But most importantly of all, it was a secret between Paul and John, one cemented by an extraordinary friendship. So in these final years of youth, at the precipice of a new life for John and Paul, and a creative direction for both of them, they let this little juvenile act become something comical and memorable, something they'd never forget. It was a secret that would tie them together, reminding them of what fun they had when they were caught up in the whirlwind of being the Beatles.
If the backstory here is messy and incoherent, it's only because the deepest and most meaningful relationships of anyone's life typically unfold in strange and unpredictable ways. You love each other, but you're destined to drift apart. You hate each other, and yet your family-like bond makes it impossible to stay mad.
So in Hey Jude, John wasn't saying goodbye to their talents or to the rock alchemy they shared. Instead, he was embracing the changes and, despite voicing his true feelings, also wishing him well. Luckily, the farewell described and felt in Hey Jude for these two magnetic artists who started out as two regular Joes did not mean the end of their own talents. We all have friends we used to be super close with, but now we don't speak to them all that much. But it doesn't mean we don't think about them sometimes and hope they're doing okay. Through Hey Jude, Paul and John went on to create and continue to transform the world through their gifts and genius.
I don't think the Beatles should go back and recreate their past. The Beatles don't exist and can never exist again.
Hey Jude unknowingly spoke a deeply personal message to a global one. In 1968, the world was undergoing many tragedies, such as the deaths of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, as well as a lingering Vietnam War. Because of this, Hey Jude stayed #1 in the US for 9 weeks. Inspired by Bob Dylan's lengthy hit, Like a Rolling Stone, Hey Jude broke the world record for the longest #1 song at 7 minutes and 11 seconds. Quite fittingly, the B-side of Hey Jude was Revolution, and these two tracks definitely demonstrated the contrasting outlooks of Paul and John.
It's such a perfect example of how the Beatles worked, a classic Paul and John thing. John hears what's going on, takes a look at the world and says, I hope you're happy, but Paul's about, yeah, I think everything's gonna be okay.
Less than 2 years after Hey Jude was released, the Beatles broke up.
We are individuals, yeah, all different. John married Yoko, I married Linda. We didn't marry the same girl.
Those dizzying heights of outrageous celebrity and having the world in the palm of their hands was over. Paul bid farewell to the innocence of youth and married Linda McCartney in 1969, who he also had 4 children with. He also began a successful solo career.
And I was always waiting for a reason to get out of the Beatles. From the day I filmed How I Won the War, I just didn't have the guts to do it. The seed was planted when the Beatles stopped touring, and I couldn't deal with not being on stage.
John and Yoko became the Plastic Ono Band and made great music together. I've heard the argument that with Yoko, John reached creative peaks he would not have been able to with the Beatles. Of course, there are some of us who believe that the Beatles should have continued on indefinitely. If the Beatles did continue on, what songs do you think they would have created in the 70s? Everyone is subjective, especially when it comes to music. Whatever the case or what was meant to be, the Beatles changed the musical and social landscape forever. So you're probably thinking, how do we know Hey Jude was really a goodbye letter for John? Well, wonder no more, here's the proof. In the 1980s interview with journalist David Sheff, John answered questions about Hey Jude.
It was written about Julian, who is my child. He knew I was splitting with Sin and leaving Julian. He was driving over to say hi to Julian. He'd been like an uncle to him. Paul was always good with kids, and so he came up with Hey Jude, but I always heard it as a song to me.
Just a few months after giving this interview, John was shot and killed. Few people know that Julian was named after John's mother, Julia, who was killed in a car crash when John was 17. This is the very same age that Julian was when he lost his own father. After John's death, Paul had to say a definitive farewell to the friend he'd met in Liverpool over 20 years earlier. This is where the farewell message of Hey Jude becomes even more poignant. When he wrote it, Paul had no idea that John had so few years left on this planet, but he'd artistically and emotionally arranged and sung a goodbye nonetheless.
If you think about it, Yoko's just come into the picture. He's saying, hey Jude, hey John. I know I'm sounding like one of those fans who reads things into it, but you can hear it as a song to me. The words go out and get her. Subconsciously, he was saying, go ahead, leave me.
In 1989, after Paul left the band Wings, he was touring as a solo artist. Despite the fact that John's death had taken place 9 years earlier, this was the first time Paul had toured. There's no time frame for processing loss, and Paul's grief and mourning were probably too sensitive for him to consider being back on the big stages before he was ready. But luckily for us, at this point in his life, Paul seemed to be ready to get back on the road and connect with the world again. In front of his adoring fans, he decided to finally play Hey Jude as part of his live set. He played it at the end of every concert, and the lengthy crescendo and culmination of that beautiful song was always the perfect ending to these performances. Every time Paul sang the lyrics, "The movement you need is on your shoulder," he remembered playing the song for John back in his home on Cavendish Avenue.
Yeah, you can't knock it. It just did so well. But when I'm singing it, that is when I think of John, when I hear myself singing that line. It's an emotional point in the song.
These performances were arguably the most emotional Paul has ever been on stage. Towards the end, he screams and he shouts, letting all of his raw emotions of grief, nostalgia, and love out.
You know what the greatest thing is? You feel this this sense of community. And in these times when it's a little dark and people are sort of separated by politics and stuff, it's so fantastic to just see them all come together singing the end of Hey Jude. And I'm very happy about that, so I keep it in the show.
Because as we all know, it's a fool who plays it cool. And a once-in-a-lifetime friendship like that of Paul McCartney and John Lennon was not cold at all. It was the impetus that would create some of the warmest and most life-altering songs, one so powerful, they really would change the world.
What I have to say is all in the music. If I want to say anything, I write a song.
I will always listen to this song differently now. It was an ode to his friend, telling him to do what he needed to do, and it was also, unknowingly, a goodbye. How did this change the way you feel about this song? But also, how did George react to all of this? He was consumed with something huge in his life. It was around this time he made one of the biggest regrets of his life and wrote one of the most beautiful songs in history, Something. Check out the story of how George found his voice while simultaneously losing the love of his life.
Hey Jude goes on for hours before the drums, when suddenly I felt Ringo tiptoeing past rather quickly, and just as he got to his drums, boom, 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 impeccable.
It's like a play and we're acting in it. It's John and Yoko. You can take it or leave it. Being with Yoko makes me whole. I don't want to sing if she's not there. We're like spiritual advisors.
If I'm in New York, I try to see Sean. If I move, I always give him my new number. I call him from time to time, but I never get a return call. I think it's to do with the difference in our ages. The last thing he's thinking about is his older brother.